In this next episode of the Politically Incorrect Guide to Pandemics, we're going to talk about how the Chinese Communist Party misled the world about the virus that it had created in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and how naive people like Dr. Deborah Birx and Dr. Anthony Fauci and others at the CDC and the FDA were tricked, deceived really, into believing that China had a handle on its own epidemic and that we should emulate China in all things pandemic. When the first outbreak began in Wuhan, as we've talked about, probably during the trials of an experimental vaccine that failed and unleashed the virus on the population of Wuhan, the Chinese Communist Party initially did what it always does. It covered up its crimes. It lied to the world about the existence of an epidemic. The first country really to catch on to what was happening in China was, not surprisingly, Taiwan. Taiwan, of course, is always alert to threats from mainland China because it is constantly under threat from the Chinese Communist Party in various ways. So when the Taiwan CDC received word that a new and dangerous virus was possibly spreading in Wuhan, they did the sensible thing. They started testing incoming passengers from Wuhan and other parts of China for several dozen different viruses. And when all of those tests came back negative, they realized that there was something new on the scene, that there was a new, highly infectious and deadly virus on the loose in China. And so they immediately banned travel from China to Taiwan and instituted controls. And for that reason, Taiwan has probably the best track record in confronting and controlling and preventing the China virus from becoming a pandemic on Taiwan. Taiwan tried to notify the World Health Organization, but the World Health Organization didn't want to hear anything from what the People's Republic of China considers to be a renegade province. And so they ignored the warning from Taiwan. When the head of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, finally went to Beijing, he had a staged photo op with China's dictator Xi Jinping, who told him that everything was under control, that yes, we had a few cases of a new virus, but that we had controlled its spread, and most importantly, Xi assured Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, who's not a medical doctor, by the way, at all, he assured Tedros that there was no human-to-human transmission. That turned out to be a flat lie. The China virus, as we all know by now, is a highly infectious airborne respiratory virus which does not require contact with body fluids to spread. In fact, one person going into a crowded room can infect the whole room because it's airborne, and it spreads by human-to-human transmission. But the World Health Organization, led by Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, who's from Ethiopia, a country that has received billions and billions of dollars in aid from the People's Republic of China. Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus is China's guy, and he repeated China's line, that there was no human-to-human transmission. And so the rest of the world remained in the dark about the nature of this virus, convinced by the World Health Organization, which was supposed to be watching out for their health instead of watching out for the political well-being of the Chinese Communist Party, had told them that they needn't worry about this virus, that it was contained. And then, all of a sudden, we learned that China had locked down 67 million people, not just the city of Wuhan, but within days it had locked down the entire province of Hubei. And other cities were being locked down as well, in the biggest lockdown in human history. And the world sat up and took notice. This must be much more serious than dictator Xi Jinping had told Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus. Xi Jinping announced to the Chinese people that they were going into lockdown, and there would be no questions, no ifs, ands, and buts about that. Anyone who refused to go into lockdown, that is to go home and lock their doors and not go out until the party told them it was safe to go out, would be arrested and taken to a concentration camp and internment center by force. That threat was actually carried out. People who resisted the lockdown were taken to so-called hospitals, which were in fact internment camps, where they were kept for weeks and weeks and weeks with very little food and very poor conditions. So the lockdown was serious, and it was ongoing. And it alerted the world that there was something more than an ordinary virus on the loose in China. At the same time, China carried out a psychological operation, a psyop as I call it. We began to see in the West pictures of people dropping dead in the streets of Wuhan and other Chinese cities. We began to see pictures, videos of body bags lined up in hospital corridors, and vans filled with body bags of corpses going to funeral homes in and around Wuhan, there to be incinerated, cremated. And we were told by the Chinese Communist Party all of a sudden that this was a very deadly virus and that there was only one way to cope with it. And the way to cope with it was to go into a total societal lockdown. Now, up until that point, China had showed the number of cases of COVID increasing rapidly. And, of course, they were still underestimating the numbers, which were, in fact, I believe, much larger. And they showed the number of deaths increasing dramatically. But when the lockdowns were put in place, the numbers changed. The curve flattened out, and it looked like the lockdowns had successfully controlled the spread of the China virus in China. Now, all of this was not true, of course, but Dr. Anthony Fauci, and especially, as she tells us, Dr. Deborah Birx, in her autobiography, in her account of the pandemic, which has now been published, she tells us that she was very impressed by the success of the lockdowns in China. Why? Because she was going by these fraudulent Chinese numbers, which showed the lockdowns completely stopping the spread of the coronavirus and showed the number of deaths plateauing. China itself, of course, was trumpeting its success in controlling COVID from the rooftops. In the Global Times, the Chinese propaganda newspaper, they celebrated on the day that the number of deaths in New York City supposedly exceeded the number of deaths in China. Of course, that was a lie. The number of deaths in China had never stopped growing. The number of people in total who died in China of the China virus is a greater number than any other country in the world, I have no doubt. But of course, numbers in China are not a reflection of reality. Numbers in China are massaged and produced to make the Chinese Communist Party look good. And in this case, to lead the United States and to lead people like Dr. Anthony Fauci and Dr. Deborah Birx into believing that China really did have a magic bullet that was capable of killing off the China virus. And it was at that point, when China claimed to have successfully controlled the spread of the China virus, that Dr. Deborah Birx and Dr. Anthony Fauci went to then-President Donald Trump and said, "We have the solution to controlling this pandemic." I don't think they told him the solution came from China, by the way, because he probably would have been skeptical. But as he later said, these two very smart people came to me and said, "We have to lock down for a couple of weeks to stop the spread of the virus." And that's what we did. We went into lockdown. You remember, 2 weeks to flatten the curve. But we now know from Dr. Deborah Birx's autobiography that she wasn't thinking in terms of 2 weeks to flatten the curve. As soon as she got her 2-week lockdown, she was thinking, scheming of ways to extend it, because she knew that 2 weeks wouldn't be enough to stop the spread of a highly infectious respiratory virus. And so she was scheming to extend it to a month, to 2 months, to 3 months. And that's what they did. They tried to keep us in lockdown for months on end. Now, it is true that if you locked everyone in their homes for weeks on end and prevented them from having contact with any other people, that you could, in fact, eventually stop the spread of even a highly infectious airborne respiratory virus. But the cost, as we now know, would be enormous. And the cost in the case of the United States was enormous. Millions of businesses closed, mostly small businesses. 10 million plus jobs lost. The rate of suicide, the rate of drug overdoses from isolation, social isolation, skyrocketed. The number of deaths from preventable diseases, because people were actually afraid to go to the hospital to have other things treated for fear of COVID, went up enormously as well. So the cost of the lockdowns can be measured in terms of huge numbers of lives lost, trillions of dollars of economic cost at the end of the day. And I believe it was all a result of a successful Chinese psychological operation, a psyop, if you will, that convinced some very gullible and naive people who had no background in China, who didn't understand the deceitful nature of the Chinese Communist Party, swallowing, hook, line, and sinker, the idea that China had controlled a highly infectious airborne respiratory virus by means of lockdowns.